Well, good afternoon, and welcome to this seminar that is being led by the Scottish Baptist College. We're going to explore this afternoon the issue of Christian discipleship and the environment. Now, I'm Ian Birch, principal of the college, and together with my colleagues, we're going to explore this issue from a number of angles, which we hope you'll find interesting and thought-provoking. So my friends and colleagues are going to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Lena, I'm native of Lithuania, and I teach practical theology at the Scottish Baptist College.
Good afternoon, my name is Graham Meiklejohn, and I teach theology and practical theology as well.
I don't think we're hearing Andrew.
Thank you. Sorry, my name's Andrew Clark. I teach New Testament and I look after the ministry development program in the Baptist Union.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, folks. Each of these people are going to take part this afternoon. We're going to each speak for a few moments, and then as we come to the end of our presentation, there's going to be an opportunity to take questions and have some discussion. So if you think of any questions or have a point that you'd like to make while we're speaking, then you can pop that into the chat and we are going to pick that up later. So our theme this afternoon is God's world, God's home, and that is what we're going to explore together. I think we're all very conscious that we're living in a time of acute ecological crisis, and you don't need to be a paid up member of Extinction Rebellion to feel that things are not going well in the relationship between humans and the planet at this present time. You merely have to watch the news or wade through the litter on the streets where you live to get a sense that there are issues that we need to think about and face, particularly as Christians. One writer who's reflected on this issue, Michael Northcott, has identified 4 features of environmental concern that we really can't keep ignoring. One is the extinction of species, and scientists who are monitoring this issue reckon that somewhere in the region of 10,000 species of animal per annum are disappearing from the planet, and that ought to be deeply alarming to us. The other issue that we're all very conscious of is climate change, and scientists reckon that the Earth is 1 degree hotter than 1850 on average, which doesn't sound a great deal, but has quite serious consequences for people who live in low-lying parts of the world. Then there's the issue of pollution, and I was interested to read somewhere that one of the kind of barometers of pollution is frogs, because frogs are hypersensitive to water and air pollution, and frogs are declining rapidly in the world at the present time. And so there is a clear correlation between these two issues that tells us that pollution is something that we ought to be concerned about. And agronomists reckon that 40% of the world's resource of good soil is under threat. With warming earth and greater rainfall, precious soil is being washed into the sea. So what are the factors that are driving the ecological crisis that the world is facing at the present time? Some of these are really well known and familiar to us, and yet we can't afford to just shelve them at the back of our minds. The increase in population, of course, which is putting pressure on our planet. And then technology, with the adaptation of the environment for human purposes to make the world suited to our needs. And then there's lifestyle issues about our desire for affluence and consumerism and capitalism, which is devouring more and more of the world's resources. And then there are global economic processes that have a bearing on this issue. And globalization is a matter that ought to concern us as Christians as we think about what it is to be world citizens on God's behalf. So what should Christians think about this issue? There's plenty of people writing about these matters from all kinds of perspectives, but our concern, our question, our thought is what should Christians think and do about these issues? Do we have a responsibility as part of our discipleship? Well, my task is to start with the Bible and to hear again what it says, and then you can make up your own mind what to think. So let's go back to the beginning, to the book of Genesis. And here we have this text which says, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." And then another text which is very important for shaping our thinking about this issue, in the next chapter, Genesis 2, we read that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. And so in terms of how Christians traditionally, that is down the centuries, have thought about the environment, one of the key ideas that has been very influential in our thinking are these texts, and especially the mention in these texts of having dominion, having rulership, having authority over all that God has created. So this is the key text in Genesis 1:26. "Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over all of the animals." In a very famous article that was written in 1966 by Lynn White, Christianity was accused of being the most anthropocentric religion that the world has ever seen. Christians have assumed, he writes in this article, that everything that was made was given for human benefit. Everything that was made was for human use, for human good. And this accusation that is made in this article, that has been very widely read and been deeply influential, is all based on how Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have been used, have been interpreted, and have been applied to our living on the planet. So Christians are accused of being responsible for using the word dominion over creation to mean that humans can take a selfish and a self-centered, subjectionist and dominationist posture towards creation. We can subject everything to our own needs and dominate everything that we see. On the basis of these texts, people have assumed that if we can do it, we should do it. From every aspect of the Industrial Revolution to human cloning, in vitro experimentation, artificial intelligence, experiments on animals, animal to human organ transplant, genetic modification to crops and plants, and we could go on and on and on. And the assumption is that because we are masters of this world in which we live, because we have dominion and authority over it, anything that can be done should be done, because humans have this right that has been given to them. But I want to ask, is this what this text really says, and is it what it points to legitimately? So let's revisit for a moment the word dominion. The word dominion actually translates a Hebrew verb which has at its root the kind of authority and responsibility that a parent is given over their children. In a biblical perspective, for sure, parents do kind of have an authority, a dominion over their family. But this is to be exercised for caregiving, for nurturing, for the sharing and the building up of love and faith and hope and trust, certainly not for exploitation. So that's where this word comes from, that kind of authority that is caregiving and nurturing. So humans are not autonomous rulers of creation, Certainly not on the basis of Genesis 1, to do as they please with all that God has made. No, rather, this word implies that our rulership over creation is in God's name and with God's authority, as we are his representatives, the representatives of the true King of all creation. And so while humans are appointed to rulership over the earth, that is under God's supervision, and we are responsible to the ultimate ruler of all things, who is the Lord himself. A second word in this text that has been controversial is the word subdue, that we are to subdue the creation. And the Hebrew verb used here means bringing things to order, putting things in a rightful place, in a good place. And the interesting thing about this word that occurs in Genesis 1:28 about subdue is that it implies that the Garden of Eden was not a place of perfection. It wasn't a static state of affairs where everything was just absolutely at its maximum potential. But rather, it implies that humans were placed in a dynamic environment where the future is open to possibilities, and the future is open to creaturely activity, and that this is going to be crucial for the development of the world. God has called us to work, to noble work, to good work, to work that brings all of the goodness out of what he has made in the first place. So this word subdue is not about crushing and smashing down and stamping on things. Rather, the very opposite. It means to put things in their place where they can rise to their full potential. Now, a second text in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15 introduces another idea about human relations to the earth, which is quite interesting to consider. And that is that it implies that the cosmos is to be thought of as a great temple. Now, that might be something that you have thought about before and heard about before, or it might be something that you have never heard before. The idea that the whole of the cosmos, the earth, the space-time continuum, everything that exists is to be regarded as a temple. Now, what does that mean? Well, John Walton of Wheaton College picks this up in his commentary, his NIV commentary on Genesis, which many of you might have on your shelves. And he notes that in the ancient world, in lots of different cultures, the cosmos, the world and the sky and space is portrayed very often as a temple. And conversely to that, in many cultures, temples were often designed and regarded as micro models of the cosmos, of the universe. And for sure, we see the same idea very much in play in the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah chapter 66, it says, "Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What is the house, i.e. the temple, that you would build for me? And what is my resting place? All these things my hand has made, and so all these things are mine, says the Lord." And here in this text, there is very close association of the idea of God's house and the earth and the universe which God inhabits, the God who is all in all, who fills all things. And then just another text. There are many texts which actually support this idea. But another one here is, "O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, wrapped in light as with a garment. You stretch out the heavens like a tent or a tabernacle." And you remember the tabernacle was the first place that the Israelites had as a place to meet the God who comes and dwells among them. "You stretch out the heavens like a tent or a tabernacle. You set the beams of your chambers on the waters, and you make the clouds your chariot. You ride on the wings of the wind. You make the winds your messengers, fire and flame your ministers. You set the earth on its foundation so that it will never be shaken." And here we see that there is an intimate connection between all that God has made in all of the cosmos and the places where God resides and the places where God is active. There's no such thing as sort of heaven over there and earth or the cosmos over here, as these are two separate spheres of action, one God's and one the human place. God, in fact, dwells in all of the cosmos and fills all things with his presence. And as I say, there are many, many texts that draw out this connection between creation of the cosmos and the creation, the construction of the tabernacle and the temple. And in fact, in the description in Deuteronomy of the construction of the tabernacle, there are lots of linguistic and ideological parallels between the building of this place for God to dwell and God's construction of the universe in Genesis 1. Just a couple of these to whet your appetite for maybe further exploration. First of all, the planets, the stars, and the celestial bodies, which are described in Genesis 1 as the creation of God, are described using unusual terms. They're described as lights. And this very same word later occurs many times throughout the Pentateuch to refer to the lampstand in the tabernacle. The lights that the stars and the planets that fill the universe are kind of have a parallel of the lampstand in the tabernacle. And then the rivers which flow from Eden, from paradise, is also an image that is not only found in Genesis 2, where they water the earth, but also in Ezekiel 47, where rivers flow from under the altar in the temple, giving life to the desert and to the Dead Sea. And then, as I've already said, in Genesis 1, the 7 days of creation, and later on in the Pentateuch, the 7 days of tabernacle construction, are clearly set in an ordered parallel to show how the two things mirror one another: God's creation of the world and then the creation of the tabernacle as his resting place. So the words used in Genesis 2:15 to describe the work expected of the first humans to till or to work or to guard the Garden of Eden are also quite interestingly priestly terms which occur throughout Leviticus. To till and to work really means to serve, that God puts humans in the world. He puts humans on planet Earth in order to serve his purposes and to serve him in the world. So these words that are used are commonly used to describe the priestly duties of the Levites who are serving in the temple, keeping and guarding God's word, as we see in Numbers chapter 3, or protecting the sacred space where God dwells. But these words that are used both in Genesis and then later to describe the work of the priests do not refer usually to agricultural tasks. So it's clear that the writer of Genesis is trying to create this sense that we're not in the world not just to be farmers, but we are here to serve the God who dwells amongst us and with us. So to go back to John Moulton, just to kind of bring a summary to this point, he writes, the cosmos is portrayed in the ancient world and in the Bible as a temple. And temples are designed to be micro models of the cosmos. Temples, as we know in the ancient world, were built for gods to rest in, which did not mean that they were thought of as being as relaxing and being idle, but rather the gods were enjoying their existence and maintaining order and security in the world. And Genesis also describes God as resting on the seventh day. And again, that temple idea of God being at rest with the things that he has made and the people that he has placed in the world is an important one. God made the world as a place where he would dwell, and he placed the humans within that world to maintain, cultivate, and care for the place of his dwelling. We're not just gardeners of the earth, but to function in the world is actually to look after the place where God is resting and God is operative amongst us. John Walton again. In the first chapters of Genesis, God is creating his dwelling place, putting people into it as his images or his representatives, and taking his place at the helm to maintain the order he has created. And unless you think that this is just a sort of a rogue opinion of one scholar, another writer, John Levinson, writes, the temple's construction was depicted as a new creation, and the temple was seen as a microcosm of the world. So quite a few people are beginning to recognize this understanding of the way the Bible portrays creation, not just as a natural environment, but as a holy place where God dwells. And therefore, our responsibility in relation to creation has become highly significant. We see this also when we think about the significance of the Garden of Eden, which is portrayed as a kind of holy of holies in God's temple of creation. It's the place where God dwells and walks and communes with the humans. And there are some texts which just illustrate that. And so, in conclusion, what am I trying to say here? Very, very briefly and very sketchily, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that humans in the Genesis story are portrayed as being like priest kings whose work is to maintain and to keep and to guard God's habitat, God's dwelling place, the place where God lives. And our mandate in relation to creation is not ecological or agricultural, it is priestly. So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to care for sacred space, for creation is viewed as a temple, the dwelling place of God. And so lastly, Christian thinking about the environment and ecology should take its bearings, I want to argue, from these texts. Texts thoroughly scrutinized, properly understood, and then seriously applied to everyday life. And then we will understand that the environment cannot be a matter of indifference to Christian faith, because God's world is God's home. And let me finish where the Bible itself finishes, with this promise. John writes, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, and I heard a loud voice saying, see, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. God's world, God's home. Now, if you think that this is a subject that is worth considering a little bit further and want to explore more about what the Bible and theology has to say about Christian faith in the environment, then we are running a series of evening classes on this very topic, which will start on Monday, the 2nd of November at 8 p.m. And this is a follow-up to some evening classes that Andrew Clark has been running on how to interpret and understand the big picture of the Bible, the big story of the Bible. And you can sign up for these evening classes through Eventbrite. Now I'm going to shut up, and my colleague Lena is going to take things forward by reflecting on how we live out our convictions about God's world and God's home. Thanks, Lena.
Thank you, Ian. What a beautiful vision this is, isn't it? Thank you for reminding us for this much bigger picture of ourselves as priests and caretakers of this earth. And it should both humble us and propel us to action, right? We cannot simply ignore the fact that a number of our daily actions damage this temple of God in real terms and in so many ways. From the release of the multitude of microplastics into the environment, to things we discard that end up in the landfill, to our buying choices that destroy the forests and the fields and the animals far and near. And of course, I could go on and on. I won't, because no matter how exciting this vision is, and no matter how pressing the need for change and reconsider our relationship to the planet and its creatures, we'll find hundreds of reasons why we cannot do it. We're too small, too poor, too busy with even more important things. We simply have no realistic choice. We're not quite sure about the scientific evidence, and so on. And these reasons will seem to us legitimate because we're really good as humans in coming up with why we can't do something that requires us to change our ways. There's a really long distance between what we agree with in our words and the place where our desires and loyalties lie, where our fears lurk, where our habits kick in. And overcoming that distance will require an intentional transformation on our part. Just agreeing that we have been called to priestly care of the earth as God's temple will not get us there. So how can we achieve such transformation? I think it means not relegating creation care into a separate category of things we should do, but rather integrating them into our spiritual life and our communal life of worship, and perhaps reconsidering these both in the light of the challenge of environment care. So I'll briefly say just a couple of things about both our Christian spirituality and our communal worship. Caring for God's home is an invitation to a kind of spirituality which embraces simple life and resists the constant lure of consumerism. It means learning spiritual rhythms which free us from this constant fuel of consumer items. It means learning sustainable ways of drawing joy from actions and habits that don't deplete the rest of creation. It means being aware of how powerful these gods of greed and consumerism are, how constantly we're being bombarded by their messages and their advertisements, so much so that sometimes we can't even imagine any other way to live. But the kind of Christian spirituality that I have in mind means mindful observation of our own habits, questioning them time and again, and learning to live differently. Learning, as Jesus said, from the lilies of the field and the birds. Learning as together and alone, simplicity and saying no to the demands of consumerist worship. And when we do that, it leads us to a much more content, less stressful life. And that by itself should be such a witness to what happens when we live out our faith in God as a creator of a good earth, good creation. So that's, I think, where our spirituality needs to change, to embrace that much larger picture of what Ian described to us earlier. But then, of course, there's a question of how much we can do on our own. And I suspect that as individuals, we can only embrace that kind of spirituality, embrace these kind of changes partially at best. Because we need the community to keep reminding us, to urge us on, to help us in the continuous transformation of our minds and hearts and our daily lives. And that's why it's so important to reconnect our experience of the mundane with our communal worship. And here I'm not talking only about congregational singing, although I am frustrated by how often it feels lofty, sublime, totally removed from our experience of every day. It's great to be transported to another reality, but unless that reality then breaks into our day-to-day living and transforms it, it's nothing but escapism. So there is a lot of work for Christian songwriters, worship leaders, and of course preachers. But I would make a plea not to think that the church needs only to teach creation care. We need to make it part of our worship life so that we can learn to live it. Only then we can start to see how it flows into our decisions, our individual choices and our decisions as a church. It is likely to be a graduate process, but it is a vital process, a holy process even, because through it we start living more faithfully as priests of God's temple.
Many, many thanks, Lena. That was a challenging message that you have given to us. And don't forget, everybody who's out there, that you can send in questions and comments that will be picked up in a moment or two. So you can ask Lena about something that she might have just said, and she'll get a chance to draw that out in a little bit more detail. And now Graham is going to tease out some of the theological implications of our theme. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Lena. Imagine returning home from a holiday to your house that you've left in the care of family members. And imagine the house was looking a little worse for wear. Iron brew stains on the carpet, furniture in pieces, and let's not even talk about the holes in the roof. This scenario is a little like how I want to think about God's world, God's home. What will we say to God when he returns home to find it's no longer fit for his dwelling? By looking through various biblical texts, specifically in the Old Testament, Ian has brilliantly conveyed to us the idea that creation is God's dwelling place. Miroslav Volf and Matthew Krosman write that the entire purpose of theology centres on recognising creation as the home of God. They write that the purpose of theology is to help human beings identify God's home as their home and help us journey towards it. It might not seem a revolutionary understanding of theology, but thinking about the fulfillment of creation as the ultimate goal of theology recasts much of what we understand to be our purpose as Christians. In short, this approach to Christianity requires us to prepare creation for God's dwelling and involves the reconciliation of all creation to its creator. And this work of reconciliation shouldn't be unfamiliar to us. Paul writes in Colossians 1 verse 20 that in Christ, God was reconciling to himself all things. And in Romans 8, he writes that creation is waiting to be liberated from its bondage so that it too might share in the freedom and glory of the children of God. And Revelation 21 tells us of a day that God's dwelling place will be among his people. In each of these passages, there's an intimate connection between the salvation of God's people and the work of reconciling all of the created order back to God. We should recognise that the salvation story is broader than just about humans. God's plan of salvation involves the whole of the created order, of which we are just one part. Yes, very much a significant part, but still just one part. Jürgen Moltmann writes that Christians should beg forgiveness for the injustice we have inflicted on creation, as if to suggest that if we remain unreconciled to the wider created order, how can we as humans claim reconciliation to God? If we inflict suffering on the created order, how can we claim to be carrying out God's will for his creation? It's a strong claim and one that should make us stop and think. As Ian helpfully pointed out, if we think about creation as the temple, and therefore Christians as a priesthood of all believers, the church must be willing to see creation as God's home and do the work of serving creation to honour God. In this vein, Moltmann continues that if the church sees itself as representing creation, then it will feel the suffering of creation, and it will have to cry out in pain and public protest. I wonder if we've ever considered that our reconciliation to God might be intimately intertwined with our actions towards creation. I hope I've managed to communicate a brief theology of creation that shows it's not just about adopting a woke left agenda or becoming a hippie liberal, but rather something that expresses the fullness of God's purpose for the whole created order. I'm not sure whether looking at the Christian response to creation has filled out my understanding of salvation, or whether thinking through the implications of the reconciliation of Christ's death and resurrection has filled out my understanding of creation. I don't think it matters. The significant takeaway is that both are intimately connected. Too often, our depictions of the cross have been narrow, anthropocentric, and transactional. But I hope today there's a sense that there's a whole lot more going on. And though it brings more responsibility, it also brings a greater hope.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you. That was excellent, and you've given us a lot of food for thought there. And just to remind everybody again that if that has triggered any questions in your mind, then fire them in, and we'll pick up those questions and comments after our final contribution, which comes from our good friend Andrew Clark. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And I very much appreciate the way, Ian, in which you started our focus this afternoon by turning to the Genesis 1 and 2 narrative. In one sense, I guess it's obvious to start there. But I'm also sure that starting there is the key. It says something important, that right from the beginning of the Bible, we get a sense that we should be viewing the world around us as sacred space, as God's temple, and to see ourselves as his priests who have been given a particular responsibility to care for creation, as those who are caring for a temple. And one of the implications of that, I think, is that we're not doing this for our benefit. And I think we're not even doing this caring task for the sake of our children and our grandchildren, at least not first and foremost. Rather, our motivation is because this world is first and foremost God's world, his home, and not ours. I'd like to pick up on a couple of implications from that, I think, that I see emerging from the material that you outlined. And I'd like to develop them from elsewhere in the Bible in what I think is a complementary way. The insight that humans were appointed as God's image bearers, to be co-rulers with him, having dominion, as you framed it, Ian, as priest kings, directly representing God in the task he shares with us, that is all a remarkable contribution of the Judeo-Christian religion. However, I want to suggest that the Bible also presents us with another neglected, a shared responsibility and relationship that God established from the outset. The opening verses of the Bible are well known. In the beginning, God created. Many of us, however, are less aware that the Bible speaks of God also sharing in this task of creating. I'm talking particularly about the neglected character in the Bible that many scholars call Lady Wisdom. The Bible talks of her in terms both of an essential attribute of the Creator God, he is wise, but also as his collaborator, present alongside God before the ordering of the heavens and earth. A master craftswoman, if you please, involved with God in the act of creating, and also one who continues to sustain the heavens and earth in tune with God, and all the while worshipping him. So, where in the Bible do we come across this figure who's called Lady Wisdom? The first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs include 4 poems which are placed on the lips of this personified source of insight and knowledge. So in her words, this is from Proverbs chapter 8, she says, "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth." So Lady Wisdom existed before the mountains, hills, and fields were formed. And she was present when the heavens were established, and also when the seas were gathered into their place. She continues in Proverbs 8 in this way. "Then I was beside God like a skilled artisan, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of human beings. We see here that wisdom is therefore part of the very fabric of creation, part of its weave, as integral as the grain in a piece of wood. So God involves wisdom alongside himself in creation. But this wisdom, including the knowledge of good and evil, is also imparted to human beings. Just hang on one moment. She's in tune with God, this Lady Wisdom, which means that she's in tune with the way that the created order works. This is why earlier in Proverbs 8, Lady Wisdom can say, "By me kings reign, and rulers decree what is just. By me princes rule, and nobles, all who govern justly." So we have here an extraordinary picture of invitation and collaboration, all initiated by God. God creates by wisdom. He then embeds that wisdom into the fabric of his creation and invites human beings to learn slowly about this wisdom. It's a long process, and it's not one to be short-circuited by grasping prematurely from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then in an intergenerational relay, this wisdom is to be passed on from parent to child. The book of Proverbs represents precisely this kind of inherited insight. It's accumulated wisdom passed down through generations, a set of observations about how the world works, about how wise people tend to be rewarded for their actions, how things tend not to work out for foolish people. We have a responsibility, I suggest, not only to live in tune with creation, but also to pass on what we have learned from our forebears in regard to caring for God's world. And then we should play our part in adding to this accumulated wisdom, hoping that the next generation in turn will also play its part. So it seems to me that the first implication is that those humans who are environmentally sensitive are those who, whether they're aware of it or not, are drawing on God's wisdom, a wisdom that is invisibly embedded within the very fabric of creation. A second observation may be that God is a collaborative being. And he intends that caring for God's creation is a collaborative and not just a sacred task. So firstly, he collaborated with Lady Wisdom in his task of creation. Secondly, Lady Wisdom appeals for people to seek her earnestly and to live in accordance with her insight, collaborating with Lady Wisdom. And thirdly, Adam and Eve were charged together to work in their task of being fruitful and multiplying, of filling the earth, subduing it, having dominion over the fish of the sea, and so on. So, Ian, as I come back to you, caring for God's creation is about recognizing that this is his home, that he wants to work with us in the task of caring for it. And he has embedded his wisdom in that creation to help us fulfill this calling.
Wow, wise words, Andrew. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we've covered quite a lot of material, and I hope that hasn't bamboozled everybody. lots of comments and questions have been firing in, it looks like. So we'll just crack on with as many questions as we can and comments. And I want to pick up one that I see in the chat box from Myri Goff, who says, thank you, Lena. What practical application can you suggest for making creation care part of our worship, which would be a good way of sort of trying, well, I was going to say earth some of our theology, but that might be a pun too far today. But yeah, what are we going to go and do? What are we going to go and do?
Yeah, what a good question. Thank you, Mary. Somehow we need to go beyond singing, "Oh Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder." And I mean it, as an example of songs that somehow, in all their beauty, still fell short in helping us to bring that to our everyday, to help to make that change. So I don't mean it as a criticism of the song. I'm meaning it as a way of keeping an eye on expressions of worship that do make that connection. Now, so one, as I already mentioned, I think is a challenge for those of us who are involved in songwriting. We need to do something about that. And at another occasion, or if somebody's interested, email me at the college. I'll send you some links to some collections of worship resources that actually do that, sung worship resources. But I'm thinking of something very simple also. A couple of years ago, I was asked to contribute to a collection of prayers on various environmental themes. And you know what was my brief? To write a prayer of confession on waste. And it was a really good experience. I've just opened it here after your question, Mary. I wrote about waste. It's a brief prayer. I constructed it in just a few sentences. But it became something that connected what we do every day and what we do in church. So if you allow me just a couple of lines. We are so quick to make waste, mountains and mountains of it. Waste around us, waste inside us, waste of time, waste of effort, waste of resources. So help us, creating God, to live less wastefully. Take us to your workshop and teach us the aptitude for saving, the skill of repurposing, the art of renewing. And I'm just thinking how easy it would be to actually make it part of our worship experience, and definitely getting our young people in and mold some prayers, draw some prayers, write some prayers, enact some prayers on any aspect of creation care, which we feel we need to reconsider. So that's somewhere, I think, where we want to start. And as I said, I suspect our children might teach us a thing or two in all of that, because some of their questions that they will be asking and their creative endeavors will be hugely helpful in that. So simple things, and just not being afraid to think of very practical issues, practical artifacts, and bring it somehow into prayer, into sung worship, into all of that.
Thanks, Lena. I mean, it might be interesting whether we can persuade the Baptist Union to create. Actually, I think there is a resources thing on their website, isn't there? A forum or something where if people do write prayers or reflections, that these could be deposited and we could share them and learn from them together. That would be good. I want to ping the second question, which George Gray asked to Andrew, our professor in biblical studies, who asks about the word study from Genesis, which is really, really important that we look closely at language. He says, should we be looking for word revisions in our Bible translations to better reflect what God intended the human relationship with his creation? Andrew.
That's an excellent question, George, and the answer is surely yes. It's a question about translation, and translation is a complicated process. And each translator or translating committee has a particular agenda in mind. So each of the particular versions of the Bible that we have are driven by certain agendas. And one of the very valid agendas that you touch on there is one in which the choice of word translation from the Hebrew, the Aramaic, or the Greek into English draws out particularly valuable issues in regard to environmentalism. One of the instances that Ian used earlier this afternoon was that of the lights in the sky, or the lamps would be another translation. And as soon as you've got the word lamp, your mind goes across to the tabernacle and the lamps and the lampstand. So I would say in Genesis 1, if we can go back to the word lamp, it's the same word as we find for the lamps in the tabernacle. It triggers ideas and similarities and connections in our mind. So I favor a wide range of translations that, and certainly for some of them, to create in our mind these parallels that do exist across the Bible. So excellent question, George.
Good. Another translation needed. One of our students, Chris, has sent in a really interesting question, which I'm going to fire towards Graham. Chris says Eden was a dynamic environment, which was a point I was making, but unaffected by fallenness and sin. So we can't fulfill the first covenant in the way that God intended for the man and the woman originally in the garden. How then do we honor that covenant today?
Yep. Great question. Lots of big themes in there, and I don't think I'm going to be able to do it full justice in one sense. Some of it, I think, comes down to definitions, how we conceive of the ideas of what that first covenant is, what we think of sin and fallenness. And as I say, not going to be able to cover all that ground this afternoon. One of the ways that we could perhaps think about it, though, is to think about approaching it from a relational point of view and saying, is there ideas of what Eden was like, this kind of perfect, unaffected, unchanging idea, and are we somehow trying to get back to that? Or is this idea of relationship, which is dynamic, changing, built into creation, and so we're not actually looking like we're trying to get it back to this kind of unchanging state that is unaffected by any kind of changes or anything like that. So I think some of it has to do with what we think Eden was like and what this kind of like perfect state is. So that would be one way I would approach it, is to perhaps think a little more and put a little more complexity in how we understand what we think Eden was like. Great.
I think I would want to really emphasize also that, you know, arising out of our study of language is if Eden is a dynamic environment in which the man and the woman can be fulfilled through their work, it is to nurture it and bring it to potential. And if some of those ideas and some of that ethos was in our own heads, I think we would think about the planet differently. But good question. I want to turn to a question that Andrew Rollinson brought in. It's from a slightly different angle, but I think a really important one. Andrew asks, do you think that our different views on creation origins, evolutionary or not, are at all determinative for how we view Christian ecological responsibility? Lena.
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, what a good question. And I'm not sure if I'm qualified to answer it, but here's what I think. I suspect the evidence would show that it does affect our understanding. And to me, at least, that suggests the importance of listening to the conversation between theologians and scientists, especially discussions along the line of creative suffering that is seen to be involved in evolutionary development, which actually creates such a beautiful dialogue, with what we know from our own scriptures, and helps us to think of the processes, including some of the difficult processes, the ones that we want to struggle with, when we observe them in a different light. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that conversation. First of all, it means being open to those who are doing science, gently reminding them that they also don't have answers, that they need, they need us theologians, they need people who talk about ethics and so on. But there is a lot that we can learn from those who are, looking into, into things like cosmology and even creation of origins. So that's where I would start. I would say there's a fruitful dialogue to be had there.
It's such a shame we're not in the same, physical space, isn't it, where there could be to and fro in. But for another day. Thank you. Graham spoke a little bit about reconciliation, and Anthony Luxton has sent in a question that about reconciliation, it changes both parties and creates something new. What does it mean that God is reconciling all things to himself in Christ? What can we say about a reconciled creation and looking forward to a new Eden? So, Andrew, would you like to...
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Anthony. What a big question. The biblical term is that indeed that summing up of all things in Christ. And I'm not sure how we sum up an answer to that in such a brief thing. I'm sure that it's no accident that as we started this afternoon looking at Genesis 1 and 2, the end of the biblical account does indeed paint this new creation picture, this new created order, which is a remodeling of what there was from the beginning. It's there, is it not, in our regular reciting of the Lord's Prayer? Your kingdom come here on earth as it now is in heaven. And that should be a driving motivation, a reconciling of heaven and earth in our discipleship, in our worship, in how we treat each other and this world in which we've been placed. And all of that is working towards a reconciled creation. That is different from the view that says this whole planet is going to be burnt up, so we can ignore everything here, and because God's going to start again. Rather, it's about that living in tune with creation and wisdom to this summing up of all things in Christ. It's an exciting picture of reconciliation, and not just between humans, but between the whole of creation.
Thank you. We could write a book out of these questions, couldn't we? Maybe we should. Well, our hour is nearly gone, but I think there's one really, really important question as well that has been sent in ahead of time, and it concerns animal rights and the issue of, if we are stewards of all creation, do animals have rights? Should animals be used for food, sport, or experimentation? So, Graham, I'm going to give you a chance just to reflect on that for maximum 2 minutes.
Thanks for this question. I think, again, it kind of comes down to some ethical questions and what we mean by rights. I think in order for animals to have rights, they would have to be able to be conscious to know that they have rights, to be able to assert that they have rights. But do we perhaps speak on behalf of animals and on behalf of animals having rights? That is a kind of way that I would want to pose the question. And I think there's also a question here about how we engage with animals. So I've got a pet dog. I love my dog. I wouldn't want to see any harm come to my dog. But when it comes to chickens, cows, pigs, especially when they're reared for food, we don't have that same sense of wanting to protect them and care for them. And in some ways, I want to wonder why that is and why we don't consider them on the same level. Is it because we reduce some things in creation just for consumption? And maybe it's actually a question of us stepping back and thinking about how we use creation and use the planet, and rather than just thinking about it as something to be consumed, and maybe think of a bit of a more holistic picture. And when you approach animals in that sense, then I think it's very difficult to at least not just dive straight in and say, yes, they should be used for food, they should be used for sport, they should be used for experimentation. Yes, there might be some cases where that's acceptable, but I think it's definitely a point that we need to stop and really consider why we're okay to consume animals without a second thought.
Really helpful, really helpful. And it's interesting that it's only in Genesis 9, as part of a fallen world, that God seems to, legitimize and authorize the killing of animals for eating. An interesting question about whether this was part of the original plan or part of a fallen situation. We shall return to this. We want to thank you all for sending in loads of questions and comments, far more than we can deal with in the time allotted to us. But we have really enjoyed doing this session. As I say, there is a follow-up to this. There are going to be 4 evening classes starting on Monday, the 2nd of November. And you can sign up for those if you'd like to be part of that, where we will have more time and space to develop some of the biblical teaching, some of the theology, some of the ethics, and some of the discipleship, worship, living aspects of this question. Thank you so much. Wish you well. Shalom. God bless. Goodbye.